Thanks, Danielle. And I'll just sort of, add as one of the co-chairs along with Ben, that, we started this dialogue because I think it's very important. And I think the need is actually increasing for, a lot of communication, I'll take the US perspective with, our, friends and allies across the globe on what I think is, growing geopolitical concerns and the attendant cyber risks from that. I think from a US perspective, the challenges grow, the complexity grows, the need to interact with others and do this collaboratively and respond, together is really important. And I find, again, the reason we started with Columbia, NUS and NTU was that, bringing people together and just discussing different perspectives on the issue, I think is really important. So I appreciate everybody being here tonight. I think we want to make sure we get more and the right people, as part of that. But let's spend a little time, for tonight here in New York, morning there in Singapore. I was just in Singapore, in October, and, the significance of Singapore and the ASEAN region, I think is, as I will say here, probably not enough in the front of minds for US policymakers in cyber. I'll explain a bit of, why I think that exists, but I think the other side of the coin is that there's opportunity to try to bring some of that forward. And I'll start with a couple ideas and then we can talk about it. I'm going to talk about sort of three things. Certainly the US perspective on Asia and particularly China, and the fact that that is just coming to the forefront at the national security, economic competitiveness level, and certainly in the digital realm and for cybersecurity. Then I thought it would be interesting because I spent a lot of time in the last few months in the interactions between the US and the Japanese, and I actually have some opportunities to talk to the Japanese government leadership about, where they stand and what they plan to do. They are pretty seized with China as well, and I'll describe that a bit. And then what does this all mean for ASEAN? And, my concern a bit that we don't have that properly factored into the equation, and that some of the things that our international engagement is doing, I don't think is purposefully exclusionary of ASEAN, but that we need to, highlight the reasons where that's a crucial element of what we should be doing. We talk about the Indo-Pacific region, but my concern, I'll just sort of lay it out and come back now and come back to it, is that the US thinks about Northeast Asia and then it thinks about India, and the area in between we don't spend enough time thinking and working together, and that there's real opportunity and a need for the US to be very strong with our ASEAN allies as that region becomes ever more important in the overall, balance of things, particularly with China, and that understanding that the ASEAN region is between two giants, as I know Ben will talk about. So, in terms of the US focus, if, a few sort of key points that just to channel, I think, the view from Washington. Just a month or so ago, the Biden administration released its national security strategy. It is it is very clear that, China is the number one, national security concern for the United States. I think it does a reasonably good job of saying that the relationship is competitive or highly competitive, but with a globalist tone, that there are areas like climate change and that because of the global nature of the problem, the US and the Chinese should try to find common ground to work on global problems together. But as a national security document, I think, the tone is definitely that this competition is one that we need to win, that it's underpinned by economic and digital technological forces first, and that we need to win that competition. A quote I've heard a couple times in the last 2 months is Rob Joyce has been a senior official both in the White House and at the National Security Agency, where he is right now. But people have said that at the RSA conference a few years back, he said Russia's a hurricane, but China is climate change when it comes to cybersecurity. That the real deep long-term challenge is not the storm that Russia causes right now, but that China is going to change the tables on us in terms of being able to be able to compete with them in the cybersecurity and really the broader technology area. I think the Biden administration has been careful to say this is not a new Cold War. I think there are actions that are being taken that are not exactly contrary to that, but that are clearly increasingly putting a sharp point on the competition. And the CHIPS Act and the technology sanctions that attend that, I'm not judging right or wrong. I'm just saying that the willingness to be very competitive and punitive, to companies that are enabling the Chinese is increasing. And I don't see, from Greg's perspective and in the discussions I have, particularly in Washington, that's probably still moving to more competitiveness and more of a perspective that we must win this competition with China versus, the need to get back to a more collaborative environment. Again, not passing normative judgment on that, just saying that's what I see in the minds of those who are leaders there. I think this administration realizes that what underpins it is the technological competition and the digital nature of where the world is going, and therefore things like artificial intelligence, farther out, quantum, who's winning the battle for the next generation of technologies. A lot of, in my mind, belated attention to 5G and standard setting in international bodies. But I do think all the way up to the very senior levels, and probably the president himself, they understand that this is the competition to win. It isn't about numbers of missiles and necessarily numbers of military platforms, but the fundamentals of the competition are in technology and economic competitiveness, but particularly the digital aspects of that. The other thing I'd say about the U.S., perspective on how to deal with this situation, or maybe the more near-term concern, is Taiwan. I mean, I have found over the last 6 months, the U.S. attention to protecting Taiwan. And I do think this in part stems from the Ukraine situation, the willingness of Russia to transgress, and, how this turns out and whether it becomes precedent setting, and whether President Xi sees, that, what he learns from the Ukraine is that he can go after Taiwan. This is present over and over again in conversations in Washington, and that I see, and I had some discussions just in the past week, both with government and sort of former government leaders, that arming Taiwan, I mean, literally arming them with regular military things, but preparing them, for the cyber conflict dimensions of this is a real priority, right? And figuring out how to do that and the complexities of it because of the political, sensitivities around that, and how signals are being sent by almost every action that gets taken in Taiwan. Everybody's very attentive to that, but I do think this is a serious aspect of where the U.S. will go, is trying to make Taiwan very, the image I like that I've heard more and more is a porcupine, like make it really painful to transgress against the Taiwanese if you're the Chinese. So, making them more of a porcupine in terms of deterring, potential Chinese action is something I hear discussed quite a bit. The next sort of topic I'd turn to is Japan. I do think, and again, in a lot of interactions with both Japanese leaders themselves, Columbia runs a dialogue with Keio University, which has a lot of senior former government officials and advisors to the government, as well as with US leaders like Admiral Blair, the former PACOM commander and director of national intelligence, who's very engaged with, giving a perspective to the Japanese, that the Japanese are fearful of the Chinese in a way that is sort of tipped the balance between, economic collaboration for the general, prosperity, and being concerned that the Chinese aggression could turn and be negative for Japan, or even being caught in the wings of a conflict that involves the US and China. I think Prime Minister Abe, obviously before his unfortunate, assassination, which has nothing to do with any of this, but he had been leading Japan in the Liberal Democratic Party to a more, a reconsideration of the post-World War II Japanese limitations on themselves around activities outside their own borders, and into an increased investment in defense, which they've authorized now, and consideration of authorities for action outside their borders, which is a really, not unprecedented for Japan in a long history, but in the post-World War II history is a major shift, a sea change in how the Japanese think about their own self-defense. Greg would speculate, I would speculate that, the Trump administration probably reinforced the notion that Japan better think for itself a little bit more about, where its ability to take care of its own security concerns. I think the Biden administration is very much seeks to work closely with Japan on those security concerns. The Japanese passed in the past spring economic security legislation, which is unprecedented, requiring Japanese companies to understand better their supply chains, and and increasing investments in Japan's ability to make sure it's economic security. They've never had economic security as a term or a sort of area of focus for themselves, and they're in the process of reconsidering their national security strategy, and cyber is an element of that. I think maybe interesting for the group is the dialogue that's gone on this year around how mature the Japanese really are on cyber, and sort of a recognition pushed in part by Americans. I'll just say, knowing some of the conversations I've had and some of the conversations I've worked with Admiral Blair on, just sort of a willingness to admit in Japan that particularly governmental efforts, but even more broadly critical infrastructure efforts, are not up to the place that they should be. The sort of quintessential example of this is Admiral Blair had a conversation with one of the Japanese legislators named Odanera, and Odanera in a public session brought up the fact with the media there that Admiral Blair had characterized the Japanese as minor league, which got a lot of press play in Japan about why is that characterization present, right? Which the background conversations around that have been, Admiral Blair has gone back subsequent to that, and they've been supportive of the notion that he, as the outsider, can say that and get attention and action within the Japanese government to deal with some of the things that they could do to improve their cybersecurity. So I will tell you, I'm highly confident that reconsideration of how they structure their cybersecurity, increasing not just investment, but the organizations, and even considering the ability to do active defense or activities outside their borders, is a very active discussion that's ongoing in Japan, and the U.S. leadership is encouraging the Japanese to mature their cyber capabilities, if only in part to feel more confident as we collaborate with them in a potential conflict. Again, I can answer questions or talk a little bit about why I think all those things in the discussion period. The last point, and I'll use it as a pivot, one of the things I think, and I've highlighted this in Washington that's problematic is using the Quad mechanism too much as sort of a regional framework for how we engage diplomatically, and including on the cyber issue. The Quad discussions cover a lot of things, but cyber is among them. You know, I find that this is more sort of diplomacy and sort of goodwill wishing than it is operational. And, you know, one of the things I also find in the Quad discussions, or when I talk to people about what's going on in those discussions, is the ASEAN region is not, you know, either present as a member of the Quad, but also sort of gets lost in, well, we've got Asia covered, we have bilateral relationships with key allies, and we've got the Quad. I don't think that's adequate, and I'm going to use it probably as an opening for Ben, you know, and others to talk about. But I think, you know, in the ASEAN region, there's both risk in the South China Seas from China that we're not probably working enough with the potential, you know, nations at risk, including some of those here on the call tonight, as well as not sort of ensuring that places like Singapore and other countries in the region, are also enabled to be a vibrant economies, you know, continue on their journey, which is good for good for the globe. And understanding that, given the proximity to China and, you know, the need to live between the two elephants, that we're having a good dialogue and in sort of enabling, you know, not forcing people to choose sides in certain places, right? So, you know, I think that requires a lot of delicacy in, you know, how we interact on these issues. It's sort of going also beneath the level of just saying everybody's our friends until we put you over the barrel to make a choice between us and the Chinese. And that we're going to have to work on that. And we may need to, you know, we do need to pay more attention to the ASEAN region as part of that. So I was probably a little long-winded, but, you know, that's a perspective. You know, Ben, I think I'd turn it over to you to see, you know, how you would react to those thoughts, and you know, give the dialogue members yours.
Thanks, Greg. Just checking if everyone can hear me.
Can hear you.
Okay, great. So thanks for ending off with the part about ASEAN states don't want to be asked to choose. I mean, that is definitely front and center of every time ASEAN member states talk about this issue. Don't ask us to choose. And ASEAN is actually going to have to develop a even more coherent and strong narrative on this. I'm going to invite my friends from the ASEAN with expertise, with deeper expertise than me on this, like Faisal and Lina, to, you know, to chime in later, right? So I know Elina's on the train right now, but you know, you can hear me, can't you? So I'll unpack some of the things that you talked about, by like the US national security strategy, which addresses Singapore as addresses China as the #1 national security concern. So that's for the US. But for ASEAN member states, China is not necessarily the #1 national security concern, nor is the US national security the #1 priority of ASEAN member states. ASEAN member states are going to prioritize their own economic digitization priorities. US national security is, well, sort of the US problem, so sorry to say. So China, on the other hand, is a huge, huge trading partner for ASEAN member states and for ASEAN as a whole, the largest trading partner. And it's like an inevitability. It's a question of like, what do you do with a very, very large economy on your doorstep, which is your huge, largest market? You don't want to treat them as your adversaries. You don't want to ever be heard calling your customer, your market, your supplier, your adversary. So that kind of language is really doesn't work for ASEAN countries, nor are ASEAN countries going to refer to China as the competitor. because it's not. It's the market or the supplier. And when it comes to things like CHIPS Act, that becomes something which is an opportunity right now for ASEAN countries because you can step in to some of these spaces, but also potential risk if it expands, that it could affect the other kinds of trade that ASEAN states are doing because of the huge links with China. So in that sense, when we look at the whole competition question, the US, I know, prioritizes winning the technology competition. But do ASEAN member states necessarily prioritize US winning? Or would ASEAN member states be quite happy whoever won? That if China won, then ASEAN member states will go with China. And it's not because of feeling any ill will towards the US, but just the sheer fact that because of economic needs, because of what the national priorities are, that's where we are. The technology is huge amount of Chinese technology available in Asia and closer and also at a better price point. And China has done a very, very extensive job with the BRI to address the economic questions in Asian countries, and in a way more than the US has, because the Indo-Pacific is a strategic question. And as a strategic question, it's not a strategic focus of the Asian countries. The Asian countries are focused on the economy, and China's focused on the economy. So you can see there's an alignment there. So then that brings us to, let me see if I let me start anything on this. I think that's pretty much that. The other one is on Taiwan. And to oversimplify it, a lot of ASEAN countries would say that Taiwan is not Ukraine. The history, the nature of Taiwan is very different from the Ukraine. The status of Taiwan, even at the United Nations, is different from Ukraine. And China is not Russia. China is no angel, but they are also, in a way, they don't run the same way that Russia does, and they don't have the same kinds of ambitions that Russia has. Because of this, if one day something were to happen, and that's actually what ASEAN member states would be very concerned about, is that would hawks in the US administration trigger off a Chinese armed response? That if there were too many calls for independence, for example, that there will be a response from China. So if that were to happen, and let's hope that day doesn't happen, that China were to go into Taiwan, would ASEAN member states come to Taiwan's help? Which ASEAN member state can we picture sending arms or supplies to Taiwan? That's a big question mark there. So looking at that, in terms of the ASEAN member countries, it's like, this is the fact is that the Asian region has certain power dynamics, has certain economic concerns. And if the US wants to have more alignment from the ASEAN member states, then the US has to meet ASEAN member states where ASEAN member states are and address the concerns that ASEAN member states have, which a lot of which are peace and stability, and not in the military sense, but in the economic sense. And in terms of technology, the restriction of technology does not help. The bifurcation of the technology landscape doesn't help in terms of trade and business and interconnectivity. So the last point I would say is that I'm not an expert on Japan, so I can't go into much detail on Japan. But one thing strikes me from that if Japan as an US ally is going to help in terms of active defense, meaning that the US DoD could use Japan servers as a staging point for offensive cyber actions on Chinese assets, then that's Japan's issue. But if the US were to ask other ASEAN member states for passage through their servers to conduct offensive cyber operations for China, that I think is going to be a concern for ASEAN member states, because that would mean that we're getting drawn into a cyber conflict, which they don't want to. It's bad analogy, but it's like asking ASEAN member states to be a staging ground for a ground forces attack. I mean, it puts them in the crosshairs as well. So active defense is something which becomes a worrying point for ASEAN member states. So for all this, I think in summary, I said that if the US wants the participation and cooperation from ASEAN member states, then definitely we'll need to have better understanding of what ASEAN member states' worries and concerns are and priorities are, and to help at that level. Then I'm looking forward to hearing from the views of my colleagues with deeper ASEAN experience and regional experience than me to fill the many gaps that I'm sure I've left. For example, I'm glad to see Elena is now off the train. So thanks.